Governor Rauner proposes a budget this election year, but it's far from being passed. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Governor Rauner made a little news this week at the Capitol. We're going to talk about it. With us today, Kent Redfield is back, Professor Emeritus of Political Science, University of Illinois, Springfield, a good numbers guy, so we're really happy to have you, Kent Redfield.
Good to be here.
Professor, thank you. And Rae Hodge is back. She is State House Bureau Chief for the Daily Line.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Rae. So, Kent, the governor proposed a budget. What do they say? The governor proposes, the legislature disposes. Is that going to happen this year, or where are we? And how realistic are his numbers? He said it was balanced. Some Democrats said it's not balanced.
Well, balance is always in the eye of the beholder. It's not balanced if you are starting from the point that you have to take existing revenues and expenditures, because he clearly has at least $1.5 billion in there that would require some kind of statutory authorization to make those changes. But that's not atypical. Most, rarely do you get a governor that says, here's the doomsday budget, and then here's, with all these nasty cuts if you don't give me what I want, because then you own the nasty cuts. And so he laid out something that you can make the numbers add up if you squint, but there are a lot of political problems in terms of what he's talking about. And we're not addressing $9 billion, pick a number, of debt that we have. We've got some funny carryover from the last fiscal year, depending on how you're counting things, and we've been pretty fast and loose. There might be $1 million that we need to do a supplemental for.
$1 million or $1 billion?
$1 billion.
Thank you.
Yeah,
okay.
And who knows which budget that fits in. And so, there's an awful lot of smoke and mirrors here. Right. But there'll be, the Democrats' response will be the same, and we'll probably put something together that will get us to November.
We'll see how it goes, because of course it was under this Democratic legislature, although there's slightly fewer Democrats, and this Republican governor, that there was a 2-year budget impasse with virtually nothing passed except the education budget 1 year. Rae, this budget is just under $38 billion that is expected to be spent. But one way, and what Kent was talking about, one of the things that the governor wants is to pay less health benefits for certain people, including retirees, state workers, and basically a shift of pension costs. 25% of pension costs for downstate and suburban schools would have to be picked up by those districts instead of the state. That is something that has been talked about before, this cost shift. Even Democrats have talked about it, but it never passed because it wasn't popular. So if the governor wants more than, I think, $250 million for something like that, is that possible?
Well, you can get $250 million or more. You can. It really depends on obviously how you balance the two things here, right? So we've got a brand new education funding reform formula that requires about $350 million. So in order to get the $465 million that he proposed, that leaves us at just about $100 million on top of that to play with in terms of funding and where that can go. Now, if you're going to devote that 100-some million to education, then you have to balance it against what you're taking back out of education. And in this case, if you're asking local districts to pick up the tab for teacher pensions and reduced health care and things like that, this could amount to some pretty big losses. For Chicago alone, that would be, was it $228 million? And then for the rest of the state,
Suburban and downstate, $262.
Yeah. So on top of that, you got to say, okay, well, I'm putting this much into education, but are you pulling it right back out with pensions? And are the teachers unions going to allow that to really go through politically? I don't know. That's touchy.
The other question about that is the governor has campaigned on, while running for office and in office, that property taxes are too high. We need to lower them.
Good point.
One thing we need to do is improve the whole economic conditions. Right. So whatever. But
the pushback we're hearing is that would cause you to raise property taxes, right? Because you've got local schools now that are saying, well, we've got to figure out how to do this if we're going to lose that kind of money. The only thing we really are enabled to, and what the governor called tools, right? He called them tools for funding. So that tool would probably be property tax raising, really the only source you've got statutorily.
Well, I think he's also talking about giving flexibility at the local level so that certain things do not need to be collectively bargained.
Right.
In fact, in the healthcare part of this, $470 million in savings in health benefits. He wants to take public worker health benefits out of collective bargaining agreements.
Yeah.
This is the kind of thing, clearly Governor Rauner has always thought, since he was candidate Rauner, that public sector unions have too much power, and he doesn't think it's right that you can bind together as a union and negotiate and help get somebody elected and then negotiate benefits with them. However, that's the law. That's been the law. He hasn't changed it. He has an overwhelmingly Democratic legislature. So again, that $470 million in savings by saying we're no longer going to allow collective bargaining for health benefits and take that out. Clearly, this Democratic legislature, I'm guessing, and you've been a university employee for a long time and now retired, but that's not something that the Democratic legislature is likely to do, is it? And so where does that leave us?
Well, the healthcare stuff some of it is tied up in the ASME contract. If he wins with the State Labor Relations Board, he can impose his last best offer.
And they haven't had a contract. I mean, it's been
sitting
operating.
there
It's more than 2 years.
More than 2
Middle of
years.
2015 is when it expired. Yeah.
He can impose that kind of cut, and it would filter down to retirees. That's different than doing the pension, the shift of this is essentially employer costs for pension. You have employee costs, contributions, you have employer costs. The state has historically paid employer costs for downstate school teachers and university people. And this would shift it to the school district or to the university. Now this is 25%. And so while this is in terms of downstate schools, $490 million hit in terms of this year's budget, long term, that's 490 plus 490 plus 490.
Because he wants to add, he wants to pay a quarter more each of the next 4 years until they pick it all up.
It's a $2 billion shift of state, things that the state has historically paid for to school districts. So that's tremendous pressure on school districts and on universities, because again, it's 25% each year. The Democratic proposals were 5% a year for 4 years, and then 1%, and it took 15 years.
I thought it might have even been one. I mean, it was very, very small movement, and they got such pushback from the local districts that they did not pass it.
And the reason the Democrats, at least the leadership, Madigan and Collerton, taught cost shift was downstate. The state was picking up the pension costs, but in Chicago they were already paying their employer, the employer share.
Yeah, the Chicago Public Schools.
Chicago Public Schools went out last year. Now the governor wants to reimpose that in one lump sum. So you've got huge political problems, and when you get beyond just this fiscal year, you're really you cumulatively put the pressure on school districts. It's a very tough ask at a time when you say we need more money for schools for K through 12, and we want to cut property taxes, and then you're throwing them over a 4-year period $2 billion worth of increased expenditures. So it's tough.
Right. And Ray, I'll note and then ask, but during his speech, the governor said the most important thing we can do is give people tax relief because they are overtaxed or taxed out in Illinois. So he wants to give a $1 billion tax cut. But what he says that is he wants to lower the income tax level on individuals from 4.75 down to 4.7, but he will only do that if the legislature passes a pension revamp, which would have to then go through the courts. It's a consideration model where you could either choose to get your 3% annual increases after you retire or have your raises figured into your pension. This is something that President Collerton a couple years ago came up with, the Democratic president of the Senate. The governor said he was for it. It didn't pass. They passed a different pension plan that was shot down in courts. Some people think this could be shot down in courts. And the governor's basically saying that this billion savings, this cutback from 4.95 to 4.7%, wouldn't happen until that took effect. We don't even know if it'll take effect in a year.
Yeah.
And yet he already came out with an advertisement, I just proposed a budget to save $1 billion.
Yeah.
Realistic or not?
I think what you just said actually that says it all. I think anybody who works for a living wants an income tax rollback to some degree. And I don't think it's unrealistic to set that as a priority for people who are very strapped on their paychecks. But I do think in terms of how our courts will work it, just like you're saying, and just the amount of push it would take, is it realistic for a one-year budget? If you're going to count that revenue into your budget, you have to be able to say, okay, well, we can realistically get that revenue this year. I don't know that that is necessarily something that's possible in any legislature that I've seen.
Right.
But,
And the other thing is, there are two parts to this. One is you put something together that's constitutional that actually gets you $750, $900 million, whatever it happens to be. So that's a tough thing to do in terms of the way people read the Supreme Court. Then you have now freed up $900 million of pressure on the state budget. And he says, well, of course, we'll take that and give it for a tax increase.
Or tax decrease.
A tax decrease, right. Ignoring the fact that we've got $9 billion worth of unpaid bills. The governor just spent all of the new money from the complete tax increase in this budget, which a lot of people think is really not balanced. And so, even if you freed up that money, would the legislature vote to then just give it away and make more cuts into the state budget? And
right.
But in terms of a shiny bauble sitting out there saying,
$1 billion.
Yes,
sure.
Vote for me and tax
right.
relief is on the way.
Yeah, and I should note, I attended part of the Sangamon County Republican Party's annual Lincoln Day dinner, which was just like 6 days before the budget address. To that partisan crowd, the governor said that he wanted to lower the tax rate on individuals down to 3%. It's 4.95. So his budget says, at best, it's going to go down to 4.7.
Yeah.
He said down all the way back to 3% in 2 years.
Yeah.
And then his budget speech said nothing like that.
Yeah.
The other thing, just atmospherically speaking, that he said to that partisan crowd was that Speaker Madigan and his cronies and what they've done to the state is a cancer on the state of Illinois, eating away at our insides and our, whatever. Yeah. And then, he comes into the House chamber to give the speech to the joint session, shakes hands with President Cullerton, shakes hands with Speaker Madigan. Yeah. Again, we have a still overwhelmingly Democratic majority. The governor says in this year, when we have President Trump possibly energizing some Democratic voters this year, but you have Governor Rauner saying, we're going to win 9 seats in the House this year and take Madigan out and get rid of this cancer on our state. Is this a way to negotiate?
Well, on the plus side, even though we've got some, familiar territory that we're wading into in terms of harsh rhetoric as the election season really ramps up, and we've got some, promises coming back and forth and some cutting remarks. What we did have, not since 2016 have the 4 tops and the governor met, right?
That's
so
right.
we at least
they
had
met
that
before the speech.
And then even
office,
GOP
right.
House Leader Bill Brady, he was the one that said that we really don't want to see a repeat of last year's budget ugliness. And then you've got President Cullerton also saying that he, quote, had some good talking points, but it was out of whack. And then you've also got Senate Appropriations Committee member Heather Steens, Senator Heather Steens. She, her response last night was, this is a budget we can work with. So there could be some room to negotiate on the ground, but I think it's like Kent's saying, we've had Democratic governors and Republican governors come out and lay some things on the table that are maybe unrealistic seeming on the surface, but if the legislature can, from there, they sort of have to rebuild it, and they sort of have to be the ones to make something functional out of this.
Yeah, and of course, I mentioned it's a political year. Of course, March 20th is the primary. The governor is being challenged within his own party by State Representative Jeannie Ives. of Wheaton, who says that he has turned back on particularly his social conservative principles, but also says gave in to Madigan on all this and bailed out Chicago public schools and all. And so now the governor's trying to take money from Chicago public schools pensions back in this budget. So we don't know where that's at, but she's not complimentary of his budget plan. David McSweeney, said,
lots of Republican
they're
pushback
spending
on
the
this.
tax money.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you had Democrats running for governor. Daniel Biss, state senator from Evanston, J.B. Pritzker of Chicago were among those. Mr. Diber from Southern Illinois, Bob Diber, who's also on the ballot, one of the 6. We're at the State House to be critical of the governor and say it's not a real budget. So it's that kind of thing, and we'll see where it goes. One of the things that the budget does call for, there is some $50 million to spend on improvements at the Quincy Veterans Home, where we've had over the last a few years Legionnaire's disease outbreak that has taken, I believe it's 13 lives of people who have lived there. We just, in the last week, heard that there were 3 more cases there. There was also one case at the Chester Mental Health Center. These new ones have not been fatal, which is good. But the governor's talking about $50 million to improve the water system and perhaps the physical plant at the Quincy Veterans Home. He also talked about more planning money or something to move forward with the Chicago Veterans Home that has been on hold. They started construction a while ago, but it's not going to open in the next year, regardless. Is the $50 million enough, or I realize this is a political issue too?
It's, you want to have a number out there, you want to be doing something. And so we're not going to renovate or build a new facility between now and Election Day in November. So everybody is going to be in favor of doing something without any, there's no accountability for that in the short term. And this is, while this is an important issue, it's also symptomatic of a deterioration of infrastructure in terms of water and treatment and a whole bunch of different things.
And 100-plus-year-old pipes.
Yeah, and
facility.
we just went through the local newspaper in Springfield. We're talking about
$40 million?
$50 million to fix
sewers.
the sewers. And so the state really, this is not the kind of budget, and we don't have the kind of credit rating that allows us to say, okay, here's some prudent borrowing and some targeted things. This is all pay-as-you-go out of current money, of which we've already spent 4 different other places. And so the rhetoric is going to exceed any kind of progress we're going to make by quite a bit.
If I could add to that, it would be really easy to tell us, for us as a state to know whether or not $50 million would cover the pipe and infrastructure replacement. It would be really easy to find that out if we could get a release of the contracted report that the Capital Development Board contracted and received on August 5th of 2017, which the joint Veterans Affairs panels in the House and Senate have been requesting, which has been requested also by others under the Freedom of Information Act, but which has not been released, which we know also exists because we have the procurement records and the hearing documents and the audio of people talking about it and corresponding about it.
So
we
you're
know
saying
that
So
what's our
I know
estimate,
Governor Rauner
right?
said he was going to be the most transparent.
What's our estimate? If we could get that, if the public could get that document that it paid for, that report that was contracted for, which now a second one, imagine revised in February was released. But if we could get that report, that would tell us about how much money we need to spend to make that happen.
And I would also say after the last 3 Legionnaires cases were reported just in the last few days, State Senator Tom Cullerton from the suburbs, I think he lives in DuPage County, who has taken a lead on this and has visited the Quincy home, has called for Frank Mautino, the Auditor General's office. He's passed a Senate resolution to ask for an investigation into what is going on there and how how this administration has handled it. So again, I don't know how fast-tracked that investigation would be, but clearly it adds to the political pressure, but also the pressure to find out what's happening. And I will say, I don't know the advisability of it or not. Governor Rauner was very tough on Pat Quinn when he ran against that former governor 4 years ago because of deaths that happened to children who DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, has been watching. But Jay Pritzker comes forward after a budget address and talks about the deaths under Governor Rauner's watch at the Quincy Veterans Home, the fatal flaw in management. Fair or not, it's there, and that's the kind of thing we're going to hear more of.
Yeah.
The governor wears the jacket. It doesn't matter, fair or unfair. That's exactly what happens. And in spite of his occasional, statement that he's really not in charge, that's what the public assumes.
But he
the
did
governor is
spend
in
6
charge.
nights, I believe it was 6, at the Quincy Veterans Home. The governor did, and then of course he is accused by others, including I'm not sure if it was Jeannie Ives, but some of his political opponents of, well, that was a good show, but what have you done, and did you act quickly enough? So we'll see what happens. Yeah. We should shift gears a little bit. The Me Too the Me Too thing has hit the State House in another way. There is someone named Elena Hampton, who was a political staffer for Speaker Mike Madigan's political committees, has claimed and had a press conference this week after a Chicago Tribune story came out, which was right after Speaker Madigan put out a statement that a longtime political staffer of his named Kevin Quinn in Chicago had been dismissed from any political work, or he was occasionally on the state payroll too, and he is no longer that. He is the brother of Alderman Marty Quinn in Chicago in the 13th Ward, which is where Mike Madigan lives. And apparently Ms. Hampton says that Mr. Quinn kept texting her inappropriately, saying he wanted a relationship and indicating that, and she kept saying, I want this to be professional, I'm not interested.
She released the screenshots of the whole thing. You can read 6 pages of it.
And so so she then sent a personal letter to Madigan's home in November, but it took 3 months for Kevin Quinn then to be released, and Speaker Madigan put Heather Wire-Vaught, who has been a lawyer for him, and I believe is in private practice now. But anyway, she and Madigan talked to reporters at the State House about this, talked about how they handled it, but Ms. Hampton said it took 3 months was way too long, and she had complained to the alderman, the brother of the alleged perpetrator, a year ago, and she has had to kind of switch her career around and says that's detrimental. Where are we on this? And has Speaker Madigan got a liability here?
Well, what we've got here is a ward office that has a political operation going on inside of it. It's a ward office.
Well, that's what ward office is.
Exactly.
Right.
It's being used for political campaign reasons as a machine. And what you've got here is you've got Hampton, who is trying to go through channels that are less embarrassing for a woman in politics. You've got somebody who's trying, from whatever statements and evidence we were able to gather and what's confirmed by both sides, someone who's trying to resolve it from the inside, either by going to Alderman Quinn and saying, hey, can you please put your brother on a leash, or by eventually getting fed up and going to Speaker Madigan with this letter. What we also have here is somebody who's got a strong body of evidence saying this needed to stop much longer ago. And she's got a point. 3 months is a pretty long time to decide whether or not some very long string of text messages were inappropriate, when most people on the surface, if they saw that on their daughter's phone, they'd say no, no, no. But at the same time, we have to kind of wonder how effective an investigation it would be when it's the private counsel of the political campaign committee, right? So you've got your committee's attorney doing the investigation on the situation. The big kind of takeaway for me, however, is that it took all the way up until rumors of a Chicago Tribune report were coming out before there was ultimately any action.
Right, and of course
Madigan's
Speaker Madigan
folks say that has nothing to do with that.
It was just that people were asking where has Mr. Quinn gone.
They completely denounced that.
Right, and
then
it just
hours,
so happened that
hours later,
the Tribune story was out.
Yeah.
This, of course, comes after there had been a woman who was working on legislation with not Alderman, his wife is an Alderman, State Senator Ira Silverstein, a few months ago. It was when a couple hundred women had signed a letter, I think it was, saying that there is a sexual harassment atmosphere under the dome at the State House. We need to fix it. Speaker Madigan was a sponsor of the legislation to fix it, but then at a hearing in Chicago on that, that's when this woman came out and accused Ira Silverstein of inappropriate Facebook messages, a lot of them,
Right.
some of them at odd times. And then we found out that there hadn't been a legislative inspector general for 3 years who's supposed to look into these complaints. And then someone was appointed to take care of that, at least in the interim. And then they found that Senator Silverstein did not act appropriately, but it was not harassment, and not everybody is happy, but that's where we're going. And this is a further question, Kent. That was a state government problem, but this is a political problem, because on a campaign, what are the rules and what should be the rules, and that's something the politicians have to talk about.
Yeah, it's a board committeeman is a political party official. It's not. There's no state money involved. This is not. This isn't state government.
Right.
There were inappropriate text messages. Now, from part of what we heard from the alderman or from the ward committeeman was that when those was brought to her attention, they stopped. And so the question, but clearly the woman's expectations about what would happen, should happen, evolved during the time that she went to the alderman and then sent the letter to the speaker. And that's perfectly understandable in terms of the environment we're in and how difficult it is to report these things, and particularly if you're in a male-dominated profession, politics, which has a long history of sexism in terms of the way people operate. And so, what the speaker's culpability or non-culpability in terms of this depends on what did he know and when did he know.
Right, and the other thing is going to be if there are other cases that come forward, because
she said there's
Ms.
another
Hampton
three?
said that there might be. So if they come forward, and we'll see how it goes, because this is going to be odd. I will also say the optics were odd. The speaker did appear before the press, but had his lawyer beside him, and most of the questions to him, he referred to her. So it is what it is. We are just about out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. And legislature, well, we're all building toward the March 20th primary, so you'll start to see on those public or non-public stations a lot of ads. I hope you don't get sick of them. Kent Redfield and Rae Hodge, thanks for joining me. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.